I'm so excited for our conversation, Andy. You and I have known each other for a while now, and I know I've had you at the ranch for a workshop, and we talked similar concept, right?
Mhm.
What's happening above ground, and that's also when you did the video micro I can never say it, microscopy
Microscopy. Yeah.
microscopy of my land with some borrowed soil from my neighbor.
Yes, the fence line, across the fence line.
And it was so cool to see, see how the soil was different, especially with the organism. But before we go there, would you be willing to introduce yourself, share your background, how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So my name's Andie, and I live in Austin, Texas. So I'm working in the Central Texas region. I first got hooked on soil biology in my undergraduate while at A&M, and I studied bioenvironmental sciences. And I currently serve on the board there, actually. So I get to stay very connected to the university, and I'm happy to say that they're always hiring and researching the microbiome in bigger and bigger ways each year. So I took a soil microbiology class there, and that was the first time I saw soil under a microscope, and it changed my life. I just couldn't believe that soil was alive and that there was a proper ecosystem there with like predator prey dynamics, and that really just changed my view of how our world works. And so I pulled on that thread and ended up working at a vermicompost facility as an internship called Texas Worm Ranch. That was my first experience really composting and growing food too. We started a few community gardens during that internship, and that led me to a farm job and then a research job and then eventually entrepreneurship. So I really wanted to make sure that my career was in soil health. And one of the ways that I ended up doing that, not having an agricultural background, was through Dr. Elaine Ingham's soil food web program. So I got trained on the microscope. I follow the protocol to evaluate soils and compost and what's living in them so that we can better understand how to regenerate our soil, similar to how a dietitian might look at your gut microbiome and help you through different diet choices, prebiotic, probiotic, and get your gut into a more functional state so that you overall are flourishing as a human. That's kind of what we're doing, but through the soil and for the land.
Beautiful. And you're very knowledgeable.
Thank you. I'm also always learning, and from people
Aren't
such
we
as
all?
yourself. Yeah. Yes. Yes, and
Yeah.
I love talking with you and anyone who has the hands-on, like, agricultural experience because, a lot of my stuff is in theory, and it's applied science is how I think of what I get to do, meaning I'm not a researcher by any means, and I love that I have to deal with the variables that exist in reality. So the reality of the farmer is that you have droughts and you have we were just talking about a pathogen breakout, the screwworm. Like you have to deal with real world variables, and in research a lot of times we're trying to minimize those variables to understand how something works, the mechanism of it. But in applied science we're really trying to understand, okay, Christine, you have to tell me how you manage your animals so that I can find a pragmatic solution for you to make sure that we're moving the soil health in the right direction. So it's the combination. We're really like thought partners at the end of the day,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
A rancher and I guess composting would be like my main practical skill that I bring to farmers and ranchers. So yeah, I'm excited to get into it.
So as for those of you that are new to me, I am an educator in holistic management. So we look at the big picture, and we're always trying to find the root cause instead of addressing the symptom. Uh, and the way we look at our land is, because we can't go in and take soil samples everywhere and I mean, we could, but I choose not to. spend time with in the microscope because I've got plenty of other things to do. But there are indicators that we can see above ground with respect to the four fundamental ecosystem functions, right? The water cycle, the mineral cycle, the energy flow, which means capturing that solar energy, and then the biological community, the diversity of species, not only in wildlife and animal organisms, but also in plant species. And there are several indicators that I'm always watching for, especially when I go visit clients and do consultations. And the number one is bare ground, the percent of bare ground. With respect to the ecosystem function above ground, and by default, what's happening below ground, when we have bare ground, I can automatically assume our soil health is struggling in that area.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I think
Because the bare ground, as with respect to the above ground, bare ground means that first of all, you don't have any solar panels, so you're not capturing energy flow, right? We've got bare ground, so when the rain falls and that raindrop falls at 20 to 30 miles an hour, right, you're compacting or you're eroding and nothing's infiltrating. So now you don't have water in the soil. Mineral cycle, you don't have grass plants, you don't have those solar panels to do photosynthesis. So the carbon and the nitrogen and the atmosphere is not getting into the soil. And by default, but because you have no plants, you have no roots. And so then you don't have the habitat for the mycorrhizal fungi and the roots to break down compaction and all these other aspects. So that's my very, very high level view of what's happening underground. Do you want to get into a little bit of what, with respect to the four ecosystem functions, what happens when they're working and when they're not working in the soil?
Yeah, I've always loved the four ecosystem functions. That's something that I've learned through you and HMI. And, looking at bare ground on site, to me, it's like we don't need to sample that and look at it under the microscope, right? Like we know that it's not a functional soil, but sometimes we do, just if somebody's trying to capture that like story arc of their restoration, right? But we don't need it to inform us like of what we could be doing differently. We know that there's likely not a lot of biological activity in there, which means that these microbes are what help generate nutrients to become plant available. So that's where the biology meets the mineral cycle. And then as you're talking about water, you can't infiltrate water or store water if you have bare ground. It really relies on the plants and all of the aggregation that is created through these soil organisms. And then of course that takes you to the solar, right? Like so you have to have the plant. You can't do one well without the other. And a lot of times when I work with a farmer who's kind of at the beginning of their journey, they want to implement one solution slowly before a second one, which and I'm sure you as a coach would have the ability to really walk someone through kind of that decision making and how to prioritize and how to roll out changes on farm. The truth is that like a lot of times you have to be coming at those ecosystem functions from a couple different directions at once. And so just not tilling anymore isn't really going to move the needle on your soil health. It has to be a combination of cover cropping, like it's maybe some specific types of cover cropping to really maximize your photosynthesis potential. It could also look like incorporating biological inoculants, whether that's coming from livestock or compost extracts. And those are the combinations of things that are really going to stimulate those four different areas. You can't just stop doing one thing or pursue only one thing. It's kind of like a combination effect in order to see that change.
I love how you shared that. I know you've heard this, and if you've attended a workshop, if those of you listening or watching the replay have attended one of my workshops, we want to know how to do something, right? We want that recipe, but when we start thinking this way, when we start thinking holistically instead of very reductionist, where we're just focusing on one problem, the real answer is it depends. And to your point, I need to ask a whole bunch of questions so that I could understand, and even guide the steward, the farmer, the rancher, the homesteader, to have them recognize that what they wanted to address isn't really effective, that we need to really find what's causing that. The example I always resort to is weeds. You talk to a farmer and he's like, I want to get rid of the weeds. I want to get rid of the weeds. But the weeds are actually helping us move those minerals, and where we've got cover, we've got roots, we've got solar panels, we've got all in. And those of you that have been with me before know there's a book called When Weeds Talk that will tell you exactly why that weed is there. And it's generally some mineral deficiency or too much of a mineral. Like I've got nightshades where the previous owner had put his fertilized hay in the same spot every year. And when I first bought the property, the nightshades were just thick in this area, absolutely thick. And because of my protocol, just with my grazing management, I don't use any chemicals. That area has the population of nightshade has drastically reduced. I haven't eliminated them yet, but it's amazing how fewer plants are there because they've moved all the nitrogen, because the nightshades are there moving the nitrogen.
I think plant type, I think you hit the reason that like weeds are so important. It's not only because they're indicating something to us, but it's also because they're serving an actual function. So I think a good stepping stone for people that I find is like, oh, they start interpreting weeds as being a communicator from the land. And that's the first step. But the next step is also having this like appreciation for them in a way. I think, that they're functioning and they're part of your journey to restoring the soil health. They are a partner to you in where you want to go. They're not actually working against you. So that there's like a rich mindset shift, and it's a constant thing that you are practicing because you can feel that in a moment, right? And have that perspective in a moment, and then wake up the next day and feel irate all over again with the weeds.
Especially when they're in your garden, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's not to say that, just because you can appreciate the function of a weed, it doesn't mean that you should leave the weed to its own devices to restore that soil. It's more like an invitation to partner with the weed to change what's going on the land. So I love personifying, for better or worse, but it's like, okay, this isn't, you don't look at a weed and think, you got this, I'll go over here and do something else. It's more like, you and I are going to do this together. So what can I do? Like having that sense of responsibility of paying attention enough to steward the land. And I think that's what, like, when you reached out to me and we were talking about reading the land and what that means to each of us, because we have very different perspectives because of our different lines of work and different approach to this. But I've been thinking a lot about how humans are necessary to healing land. I think there's this misconception that we need to leave land alone and like let it rest. And I have just not found that to be all that helpful, because the truth is we've already disrupted so many of the natural cycles that keep ecosystems functioning. that when we then abandon that land, there's even less stimulus and less potential for the land to restore itself. So it really does require our participation, and I think that's a really cool thing, that we get to be involved in that process.
Yeah, we get to be in relationship with it. And just to clarify your point, many of us are whether we buy the land, whether we inherit the land, are starting on very degraded land, right?
Mm-hmm.
The extractive methods that have been in place since the Industrial Revolution has, in an extreme case, has converted it from soil to dirt. Dirt has no biology.
Yeah.
And these extractive processes mean that because the human has created the extraction, I think it is also our responsibility to help regenerate, these functions that we've broken, basically, because of our actions.
Right. Yeah. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about, how just not doing those things, not using fertilizer, not using herbicide, pesticide, doesn't necessarily make you a good steward. You have to take it a step further. It doesn't necessarily make for healthy soil, is probably a better way to put that. You have to, it's like a yes and situation. Yes, I'm going to not do those things. And also I'm going to start doing these things and relating to the land in these ways, and observe and let that inform your next action. And your next action, it's a very reciprocal conversation between you and your land.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it's learning how to read the land. We were just talking about weeds. I remember Betsy Ross. Were you here when Betsy Ross came to
No.
the
Oh, I'm
workshop?
so sad. No, I had actually like gone down a rabbit hole learning about Betsy Ross, and then shortly after getting certified through Elaine's program, I reached out to Betsy because she's in the region. Like she was only like an hour from me. And the manager had picked up the phone and had to give me the news that she had passed only like 2 weeks prior to my
Yeah,
to my
yeah,
calling. So
yeah.
I'm so glad that you had an experience
Yes,
with her.
she was fabulous, and I had an experience with her when I first started all of this 2 properties ago, and I was struggling, and I didn't know what I was doing, and I hired her to come and tell me what to do on the land. Again, I wanted the recipe, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Before I learned that there is no recipe, and she drove down the driveway, got out of the car, and even before she said anything, she pointed at a couple weeds and said, "You had manganese issue here, you've got a copper issue here, and you've got all these other things." Now I can't remember everything, but she just floored me. She's like, "What are you talking about?" And then that's where she shared with me that the weeds are a huge indicator to what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And she was the one that introduced me to compost extract. And if I did just put out a private podcast that shares my story, and so I go into detail about how I didn't pay attention to what she was telling me until much later.
Oh, interesting.
Because we get so tunnel vision. I've got to
Yeah.
fix this problem. I got to fix this problem, which leads me to this statement that we are stewarding very degraded land. Um, how I think and how I guide the people that I work with is to start changing how we're looking at things, to change from looking at things very reductionist, because nature is complex, right? And I understand the complexity is too much for our brain to
Mm-hmm.
handle. And so it's easy to say, I've got weeds, I'm going to kill the weeds because I don't want the weeds. But when we start understanding that they're there, it means that now you've got to be paying attention to all of these different variables, and then you've got to decide what is my best action given all of these different variables. And it takes time to continue thinking that way, you
Mm-hmm.
know. um,
Yeah.
on And so it is training, it's a way to start changing our habits, our way of thinking, so that our first reaction isn't, I'm just going to go to the feed store and buy Grazon
Right.
to pour in the hay fields to get rid of this because I need to sell clean hay.
Yeah, isn't it like I would want to know that the weeds aren't there because I improved the soil as opposed to eradicating them in some way. And you never eradicate them. Like you
Yeah.
just poison them year after year because they always come back. And by doing so, you're keeping your soil in an early succession state, meaning you're always going to have weed problems. And so you're always going to have to spend money on that crap. And you're never actually fixing the root of the problem. So you're just like insisting that you stay in this negative relationship rather than repairing it.
Sure, sure. And because the land has been trained, has become an addict to this herbicide, to this fertilizer, then the worst thing we can do is to quit cold turkey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
That's the disaster. That's the train wreck.
Right. And like those weeds will come back with a vengeance. But that's also like Mother Nature's way of repairing. And so the question is like, you as a land manager, how do you want to, you have to be pragmatic in the fact that, especially if this is a business, like you have a bottom line to be aware of. And is there a way that you can kind of toggle your approach so that you're not in this position where you go cold turkey and then have a real issue that's competing with like your crop, or is not good forage, or what have you.
Yeah. And this is where we suggest, my fellow educators and I, we suggest to do a safe to fail trial.
Mm,
Instead of doing the 100 acres,
yeah.
use an acre, 2 acres, 5 acres, whatever you're willing to risk, right? And just try this new practice, try whatever you're curious about and see what happens. And if it works, then make it a bigger area the following year. If it doesn't work, then okay, well, this isn't the right thing to do. So
Mm-hmm.
because we recognize, profits are needed. There's a debt load that needs to be paid. There's also the mindset shift that needs to be proven, right? We need to see this works, and now I have the confidence, okay, this worked on this, so I'm going to increase it, and maybe I'll try something else on a different area. Because again, there is no recipe, and what works on my blackland clay, where I get 46 inches of rain on average a year, is going to be different from my neighbor 2 miles down who has sandy loam.
Mm-hmm.
A pocket of blackland clay. So my land is going to respond very differently and react very differently than a sandy loam.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, and that's part of like why part of reading the land is knowing the elements of your soil, right? And understanding how it might react to your management practices. So when I go to an initial site visit, like we're digging and we're feeling the soil and we're making observations at different, I would say like landmarks, so like, oh, things look a certain way over here. Like maybe there's a lot of woody vegetation in one area, but like early succession weeds in another. So we want to like investigate what kinds of soil you have there. And there's all sorts of tools to get scientific about it and like monitor in that way. But I wouldn't underestimate the importance of making your own observations and documenting them yourself, because those are the kinds of things that will give you a personal point of reference rather than just like a data sheet that somebody else sent you. that may or may not mean anything to you until you have enough data to really reflect back on it in a meaningful way. But I think and especially early on, like touching, digging, like making those observations in a notebook, taking photos, those are the kinds of things that really form you and your confidence as a land steward.
Definitely. And it's also a way for you to monitor to see if your management is actually moving you in the direction you want, right?
Right.
So like yourself, my first initial assessment with a client is go out and walk it, and we take a soil sample. We have the soil analyzed so that they have that baseline aspect.
Mm-hmm.
I learned this from a colleague of mine who's down in Corpus, and she had sand, basically, beach sand. And she took baggies of sand every year. And so she had 10 years worth of baggies of her soil. And
Huh.
it went from being very white to actually within 10 years, it was actually brown, kind of
Wow.
chocolate brown,
That's
because
cool.
because of her grazing management. And it becomes a bragging right? This was 10
Totally.
years ago. This is so and to your point, it's a confidence builder. It's like, okay, we're going the right way.
Yeah. I love that she saved them, because usually, we take samples and we mail them off and we don't think to reserve a little. It's like a timestamp in a capsule. It's a little
Right.
time capsule. That's really
Yeah.
neat.
Well, she's a Montessori teacher, so she knows
Ah,
the aspect of the visual.
yes. Genius. I love that.
um, you're in Central Texas. I'm in East Texas, so rainfall is different, soil is different. Um, have you had experience with the encroachment of the cedars and the mesquites,
Mm,
and helping address that encroachment of the cedars and the mesquites
yeah.
and the woody species?
Yeah, I'd say a little bit. My what I was saying earlier about like just being, I really consider myself a thought partner. I am definitely not an expert on reading land. I'm always learning how to do that better and learning from different people's perspective. So, when a rancher is griping about mesquite on their land, I think it ends up making for a good conversation, because I ask them curious questions, because I don't know how mesquite has behaved throughout history. I mean, other experts do, that have studied that. But I asked them, why is this a nuisance for you? So like getting into the specifics of what's problematic about it is helpful for me. Understanding their observations about where it's cropped up and where it hasn't. Um, different life stages of the plant, like, and yeah, mesquite's one of those that I'm starting to learn is creeping farther north, and I'm sure that has to do with changes in climate and temperature. Um, but there's historical accounts of mesquite being like a towering, powerful canopy, like shade for cattle drives across the state. And that's not necessarily where we're at with the mesquite that we're dealing with now, because we're constantly keeping it suppressed. And so sometimes I wonder, is there a place for mesquite on our ranches? Could it be embraced as a shade break? And um, but obviously it's also an indicator. It itself is a legume. I think it's one of those things where if we do tend to see it in soils that are having a harder and harder time retaining water. Okay, so usually these are soils that are, there have been signs of bare soil in the area, and mesquite starts thriving. So to me, I think, trying to get in that appreciation mindset and curiosity mindset, it's like, oh, isn't that interesting? I bet Mother Nature tried putting a lot of different vegetation here, and probably due to management practices, all of those things were battled with. And so then she brought in the big guns with the big thorns and like a very fast grower. And this is something that's harder to contend with. So it becomes the legume. And even though it's a woody plant, I kind of view it as an early succession species because it definitely indicates and reads that way on the land. So yeah, these are just like my evolving thoughts on mesquite in particular. If we can restore the way that the soil functions and helps infiltrate and retain water, we find mesquite doesn't love that because it doesn't like having its feet wet. So um, that to me is something that's fixable through management practices. Um, Whereas juniper, the more that I've learned about juniper trees, or some people call them mountain cedar here in Central Texas, is I think they're maligned in a way that you can it's kind of a myth that it's working against you. Like there's a really great book, I haven't even gotten all the way through it, but it's by a new friend of mine. She's an ecologist in this region called her name's Elizabeth McGreevy, and the book's called Wanted, Mountain Cedars, Dead or Alive. And it's a long history of the mountain cedar and how it behaves from an ecological perspective, and accounts from like early accounts, written accounts of how much cedar there was in certain regions of Texas. And from what I've gathered and what I've learned from her so far is that the cedar is really important to especially our karstlands, which is the shallow limestone soils. So it really can help anchor and build topsoil, like all of those fine kind of needle-like leaves that it has create the duff layer on the ground, and that breaks down eventually into topsoil that can later support other types of vegetation. So I think we balk at it because it can kind of appear invasive and almost like a monoculture. Uh, but I think that's another indicator. It's just on a macro scale of like we've eroded these topsoils so significantly, and this is a well-adapted tree that's actually restoring the topsoil, and yet we continue to rip them out of the ground and like bring in a bunch of topsoil and try to plant anything else other than cedar. So there's definitely a place for both of these trees that are often maligned. And it's not to say that you shouldn't ever chop one down or whatever, but it's changing your relationship with it and finding like what function it's actually serving and seeing if there are ways to partner with it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I have found that everything we see above ground is a symptom of previous management.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Sure.
If we have overgrazed whatever has been growing there, then Mother Nature, and Betsy Ross would say this, Mother Nature does not like to be naked. So that first succession plant is going to be her first line of defense to protect herself.
Mm-hmm.
It could be the weeds, it could be the woody species.
Yeah.
And especially in more brittle environments, which Central Texas going west is a more brittle environment because it's less frequency of rainfall. That first line of defense is that woody species, to your point, the thorns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting to see how land that's either neglected or just like unmanaged, it very quickly becomes a thicket around here. So it's not likely to stay bare long unless there was some source of significant contamination. There's enough rainfall, and we're kind of in, much of Texas is considered like subtropical, even though we have long periods of drought that maybe East Texas doesn't. We still have enough rain, and the clay soils, at least in the east side of Central Texas, retain enough water that we have a lot of vegetation growing. And so yeah, I think I'm kind of trailing off there, but like these plants are able to form a thicket really quickly is where I wanted to go with that. And sometimes you think, okay, well, that looks like it's farther along in ecological succession, so the soil must be pretty healthy there. And I personally have not found that to be true. And I think the more I reflect on this, let's say I go take a sample from a thicket that's kind of on a fence line, it's been pretty neglected, or unmanaged, no grazing, no kind of management, no fire, no mowing, pruning, like none of it. And so it just becomes this very, like, vines are on, a mix of juniper, cedar, and yeah, and it's young trees. And so you go and I take a soil sample from there, and expecting to find a lot of fungal activity, and just like more of these predator activities, protozoa, amoeba, flagellates, nematodes, that sort of thing. And a lot of times I don't. A lot of times it can look very similar to an early succession soil that's mostly bacterial and doesn't have a lot of biodiversity. And I think part of the reason is, first of all, to me, that tells me this might, even though above ground it looks like things are moving along in succession, then you start paying attention and you're like, well, that tree is not healthy, and neither is that tree, and neither is, like, a lot of times the trees are not healthy. And and then the soil tells that story too, like the soil is not really healthy. So then you start thinking about the greater ecosystem and the animals on that land. And when it really drives home the fact that you need a lot of animal activity disturbance of some kind and defecation and even like death and decay. Like, you need a lot of that activity to have a healthy ecosystem above and below ground. So why isn't that happening? Well, it's because we have fence lines and urban, like it's all of that. What's that word for cutting up land? Like, there's not fragmentation, land fragmentation.
There we go. Yeah.
So, that's, I think, a core part of what we're dealing with on land that you think you're letting it rest and rejuvenate itself through natural processes, but it's really not a natural process with all the land fragmentation that's the world we live in, right? That's the world that our ancestors in a lot of ways like created for us. And so it's the land we've inherited. And the response that I think we should have is that, oh, okay, there's not a lot of herding, there's not a lot of wildlife, really, not in the way that there once was. And there's not these herds of animals that come through, like the American bison. So how am I going to help manage this ecosystem in a way that mimics that? And that's where we get, the concepts that are in holistic management. But it's so important that you recognize that we're missing a huge part of what keeps an ecosystem healthy. So we, as the land stewards, need to fill that role.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. You mentioned, and I want to dive in a little and get nerdy a little bit. You mentioned about the fungal component versus the bacterial component. How I understand that there's a shift, and I recognize that I tend to be more fungal here because of the amount of rainfall and because we tend to want to be forest here.
Yeah.
And the woody species tend to be more fungal dominant.
Right. And that's like a pretty direct correlation in what fungi like to eat. So fungi prefer very carbon-rich sources of food. They love wood chips. They love fallen dead leaves. That has a really high carbon to nitrogen ratio is how we talk about it in terms of feedstocks for composting or really any kind of vegetation. We're like, what's the carbon to nitrogen ratio? Because it'll kind of determine what's decomposing it. And in a forest ecosystem, you have a lot of dead wood and a lot of fallen leaves. And so that can encourage saprophytic fungi, which are distinctly different than mycorrhizal fungi. That mycorrhizal fungi do not feed on decaying sources of carbon. They get all of their carbon needs directly from the tree or plant themselves. So that's like an obligate symbiotic relationship, to get nerdy about it. And so, yeah, there's this in theory, when the landscape is getting more complex and more woody, the soil ought to reflect that in getting more fungal and as opposed to more bacterial. So yeah, the spectrum, there's like a diagram that shows succession above ground and then like below ground, how that correlates to fungi to bacteria ratios. And I say in theory because, as I've just shared, when I take samples from a thicket, that's not always the case. It's not always got the fungi to bacteria ratio that I would expect. And frankly, that correlates to when I look at the decomposition rate of what's going on the thicket floor, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's just a buildup of a lot of that material, and
that's not decomposing, right?
It's not decomposing,
right.
And so, and that's a fire risk. That's a huge fire risk. I just started like a wildfire safety subcommittee in my neighborhood because we have a lot of this going on around us. So yeah, it's kind of like when you go to a site visit and manure is not breaking down, you're like, okay, something's going on here, that like the soil's not functioning in the way that there's not a lot of biological activity to integrate that manure into the soil. The same is true of any kind of mulch layer. A lot of people in like landscaping context want to buy mulch that they don't have to put down for over a year. And it's like, no, you want that breaking down because that tells you that your soil is actually taking it up, breaking it down, and active and healthy, but when your soil or when your mulch isn't getting incorporated into your soil, like that's really telling. So yeah, I think that happens, that the whole concept of succession that you're asking about, of like fungi to bacteria ratio, it's not happening in a vacuum. So it is helpful to still look at soils under a microscope, even though you might be making certain observations from above ground. But oftentimes you can start piecing things together, like whether things are decomposing or the health of the vegetation that you sampled the soil from. So
I had a client that they had just purchased some acreage that had just been deforested.
Mm-hmm.
And she had this vision of beautiful, lush pastures. And they bought it in May. They bought it in March, and in June she called. She goes, "Christine, everything that's growing is poisonous to the animals."
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to Mother Nature's doesn't want to be naked. She's going to throw the first thing available because it was so fungal, because it was previously forest.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff that came up was not grasses.
Mm-hmm. Right. Like you might have knocked it back in succession, but not that far, not to pasture.
The soil environment is still the same, which is one of my concerns with people that grub the cedars and the mesquites and stuff.
Yeah.
Yes, they remove what's happening on what's being evident above ground, but they're not changing the soil environment to keep that from coming back.
Right. And this too is why I do think it's really important to sample for soil chemistry and soil physics, like the other attributes of soil outside of biology, it is to understand your pH and and it's not because we're going to run out and get lime, immediately. It's because we want to really understand where are we in terms of the ecosystem. And a lot of times the more fungal activity you have, the more acidic that soil becomes, because there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is because that's how fungi eat. They create organic acids and they dissolve material outside their body to take up the nutrients that they need, and so they're lowering the pH as they're doing that naturally. It's not, you know, overnight or anything, but that makes me think, just kind of in this moment, I'm thinking about how so much of the shallow limestone soil that we deal with in the hill country, it's super alkaline from the limestone, and you know, the type of activity that you get from the woodier species is going to help balance out that
Sure.
pH so that you can grow anything else.
Sure.
You know,
Sure.
so yeah, there's always more to more information that you can gather just to help piece together that story. I really don't like getting myopically focused on the numbers and trying to like manipulate the nutrients or the pH like directly. It's more about capturing information and like figuring out the narrative that you're dealing with and that you are a part of, so that you can be a participant in moving it in the direction that's good for you and good for the greater ecosystem.
We're detectives, aren't we?
Oh yeah, big
We're
time.
detectives.
Yeah.
I know that I had asked you, when I asked you to be on here, that I wanted you to address for using fertilizers.
Right.
You know, we take a soil sample. It says, you know, depending on the soil lab you use, it could be the Haney test or others, but there's always recommendations on what to do. And fertilizers are the predominant recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens, especially to this degraded soil that most of us are managing, what happens when we put that chemical fertilizer on there with respect to the soil biology below ground?
So there's two things that immediately come to mind. One, these are salt-based fertilizers, so they can literally, when they come into contact with soil biology, they can dehydrate them and kill them pretty immediately. The other thing, though, that's a little more abstract, but I think even more devastating long term, is the fact that when we're providing water soluble nutrients through the form of these salt based fertilizers to the soil environment, we are now disrupting the plant microbe relationships. So the plant no longer has an incentive to pump out its root exudates that keep the microbial communities stimulated and doing what the microbes do, which is not only provide nutrients to plants, but they create all of these exudates themselves that create aggregation in the soil and have these many benefits to us as the land manager. So when we disrupt that, we're really like collapsing the system that we depend on for our plants to be healthy. And it's putting the onus on us to give the plant everything it could possibly need. And like, we're not going to hold a candle to the benefits of a healthy microbiome. I mean, these plants and these microbes have evolved together for hundreds of millions of years. So the fact that we think because we invented fertilizers and we can make a normal looking plant, that's for sure, but the more we know from research, the truth is that we're not making very nutrient dense plants, whether that's forage or crops, and that has huge implications on the quality of whatever it is that we're trying to grow, and then the quality of what we eat, and then the quality of our own health. And so we can instead take the position of, instead of being like, I'm going to give the plant everything it could possibly need and defend it from everything that could possibly attack it, maybe we'd be better off if we said, I'm going to make some introductions between the plant and the microbes, and I'm going to mimic some of the things above ground that would stimulate the soil, and how topsoil is just naturally built. And those are the kinds of things that are really going to be a better long-term solution, much less costly.
Much
But
less costly.
much less costly, more complex, right? Like but what a rich experience. You get to learn how to interact and have an ongoing conversation with the land, as opposed to trying to simplify it and then guaranteeing that you're going to be stuck in this dynamic that's very costly to you personally, financially, and costly to the environment and the actual health and nutrition of what you're trying to grow.
And it's not only costly, but every year you have to use more because now you've deteriorated soil health even more.
Yes. Yeah, it's a negative feedback loop, and regenerative agriculture is all about the positive feedback
Right.
loop. Yeah.
So I know I'm going to ask a very complex question, but you made a comment that because we're adding this fertility, that means the food that we're producing doesn't have the nutrition. Can you give a very simplistic explanation why the nutrition isn't there?
Well, if you think about what nutrition is, it's not just nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which is what most of our fertilizers focus on, because it does turn out that you can make a pretty normal looking plant and a pretty normal behaving plant if you give those macronutrients, and then also with some consideration for micronutrients. That is just our very simple human understanding of how plants work. And we also know that nutrition isn't just about those nutrients. It's about the secondary metabolites that plants create. So think about like antioxidants. Why do plants create antioxidants? What are the conditions under which they produce them? Sometimes it requires stress and a stress response in order to produce things like anthocyanin, like this like kind of pigmentation in a particular fruit. Or I think of like lettuces. There's certain lettuce varieties, and that ends up being a really useful thing for our bodies to ingest, and begets better health in us. But if we're only focused on these macro and micronutrients to make like the plant green and standing up, like that's kind of our bar for what we're trying to do, as opposed to really focusing on what's making it into the edible parts of this plant. I think if we were more focused on that, we would find that our management plans would have to change significantly in order to produce the best quality product from a nutrient perspective. And they produce a lot of those things from their dynamic relationships with microbes, right? Like having a microbiome that's living on the stems and the leaves and in the soil, and even in like the airspace around them. Like all of the communications that are happening there can improve the expression of that plant, and ultimately the nutrients that end up in that fruit. And like we're ruining that magic by being so arrogant that like we think we can give the plant everything that it possibly needs to express itself to the best potential.
And maybe I'll write an article on this, but Dr. Stefan Van Vliet at Utah State, he has done the analysis of an Impossible Burger, which is the man-made burger, versus a real grass-fed, grass-finished burger. And his conclusion is exactly what you're saying. The Impossible Burger meets the macronutrients that are on the nutritional label, but it's missing everything else.
Yeah, the nuance. And that's where like vitamin, and we have to admit, like we don't know everything about human health. We don't know everything about plant health, or the where the two intersect. So I would rather be participating in a system where I'm facilitating the magic, if you will, the unknown science of how that works, rather than pretending like we know everything we need to know in order to produce food that powers our bodies well.
Yeah.
I think that's it's a human tendency to think that way,
Of
right?
course.
And
Of
totally
course.
relatable, but it's
Yeah.
also incredibly arrogant and like
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
not not actually how the world works.
Yeah. Oh, we could talk about this for hours. And and for those of you watching the replay or here, we started with soil and now we're talking food and nutrition. So
Yeah.
everything is related, right? Um, Andie, we do have a question. Can you explain some of the differences between compost and compost teas on larger scale applications of compost is hard?
Mm. Yeah. Okay. So there's there's many different ways that you can get compost out onto land. And when we talk about compost, I'm talking about biologically active compost, right? So I just want to there's a difference between composting as waste management and composting to raise beneficial microorganisms to inoculate your soils. So those are two different things, and I'm talking about the latter when I use the word compost. So when you make a rich solid compost, you could top dress it, or even till it in if that context made sense, which tilling doesn't always make sense, of course. But more often than not, we are taking a little bit of the solid compost and making an extract with it, because the water becomes a carrier for that compost, and it allows it to soak into the soil. So um, you can apply this at scale. You can make extract at scale and you can apply it at scale. I have a whole presentation that I actually published on my Substack. So there's a video presentation on my Substack, Soil is Sexy, that goes over different scales of making and applying compost extract. Now, the difference between, well, let me finish my thoughts on extract and then I'll touch on tea before wrapping up. But the extract is my preferred way, most practitioners' preferred way of getting the benefits of the compost out on the land, because it requires so little solid compost. So it stretches it. It goes a lot farther. When you top dress, inevitably you're going to be a significant loss of the microbial benefits, because it's just exposed to the elements. Whereas with an extract, you're really trying to get it to soak into the ground, and or you can apply it foliar to make contact with the leaf surfaces and become in relationship with the plant above ground as well. So that's also an option. Now, the difference between an extract and a tea is that a tea has a brew cycle. So all you're doing with an extract is you're trying to dissolve or knock the microbes off of the surfaces of a solid compost substrate and suspend them in water. So there's different ways that you can do that. And then so that's a compost extract. And then if you wanted to make a tea, you would take that extract and you would put it in a brewer of some kind that's going to bubble and aerate it. And then you would add microbial stimulants, foods like kelp and humic acid, and maybe even a little molasses and stuff. And the intention is that you're trying to further increase the beneficial microbes within that compost extract and increase their numbers before putting it out on the land. It also makes the liquid a little bit stickier, so compost teas can be preferable for foliar application because they're thought to adhere to the plants better. However, and this is a really important caveat, more often than not, when I help people like look at their teas that they've been making, they have inadvertently degraded the quality of their microbial quality rather than improved it through the tea brewing process. And that's because there's so many variables, right? Like even the ambient temperature will significantly change how the microbes reproduce. And even if it's actively bubbling, it can actually be anaerobic. Like I can take a sample from an active bubbling tea brewer and put it under the microscope and it's already gone anaerobic. It's because there's so much reproduction happening that they're taking up more oxygen than can be possibly put back in. So I always advise people, don't mess around with teas. It's fine to just do an extract, because you know if you have a good quality compost, you're going to have a good quality extract. You can still put things like kelp and humic acid and whatever else. You already have humic acid, by the way, in a compost extract because it's in your compost. But you can add those microbial foods if you want, as a packed lunch with the microbes before you put the extract out. But I wouldn't brew it, because a lot of times it just gets really bacterial, and sometimes there's a risk of it going anaerobic. So it's just way more complex than I think it needs to be. An extract is super straightforward. You just make it when you're ready to use it and get it out on the land.
And you can't store it, right, Andie? You
right.
have to use it right away.
Yeah, I would use it right away. An extract is more forgiving in that way too. And that, like, if you kept an extract aerated, you could probably use it within a day or two. But my advice is just, it's so easy to make, even at scale, that you can just plan to apply it the same day that you make it, instead of making it to store it and applying it another day. So yeah. And then as far as scale, there are people putting these through irrigation pivots. There are tow behind tractors that have been modified with boom sprayers, and even like drip lines going into like no-till kind of cultivator shanks. There's there's drones, there's like crop dusters being repurposed for this stuff. There's like, higher tech things, but it can be pretty simple. There's even really low tech things where it's like you have a big tank and just use gravity to come out and hit a fan plate that will kick the water into a spray pattern. So I've seen all sorts of different ways that people are getting creative to do this. And it gives me a lot of hope to see people repurposing some of their conventional equipment and getting it, you get it cleaned out, and we can test it and make sure that it's not killing the biology. But yeah, that's a beautiful thing when something that was being
creativity.
used.
Creativity at work.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the questions, and do you have some idea on helping gut microbiome of animals? Nutrient density on the forage will help with that. But as you were talking, can we feed these extracts to the ruminants to help with microbial activity in the rumen?
I personally haven't had an experience where anybody's doing that. The rumen, and this is where your expertise would come in too, Christine, is like the rumen's an entirely different environment than the soil, right? But there's a lot of, for one, like it's anaerobic, right? Where a lot of these organisms we're raising in our compost and distributing on our soil are aerobic. So in a lot of ways, if you were to apply it, let's say like a healthy compost extract to the feed for a ruminant animal, I think it would be more about like a prebiotic that, or maybe it's a probiotic. Sorry, I'm not an actual dietitian, so I might not be using the right terminology. But it has a lot of like molecular value that could help promote the kind of biology that you want in the rumen. But I'm going to say all of this with a huge grain of salt, because I wouldn't want you inadvertently changing a ruminant's diet and it having issues. But I do know I've worked with people that are creating bottled products that are biologically active, that are specifically for wound healing and gut microbiome promotion in livestock. So they're the livestock experts, and I just tell them what I'm seeing under the microscope with their product.
Who's that, Andie?
This is Soil Basics in California.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Good. We'll research it.
Yeah.
Well, I know we could go on talking forever, and maybe we'll schedule another one.
Yeah,
another
this was fun.
But thank you so much for being with us and for sharing all your wisdom. And for those that are listening and live or replay, I apologize. I can't stick to one thing. It because of all the relationships, I go we go all over the place and conversation flows as it needs to go. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Andie.
Yes, thank you, Christine.